Welcome to another episode of Appoh's Aim Academy. This episode is going to be talking about aim styles. So we're going to be discussing how you aim as well as what the name is of different styles within aiming. And then just sort of give you a little bit of tips and tricks on each of them. So the first things that we need to understand is essentially how we're aiming, which is, are we using our wrist or whatever? So we talked about it before, but wrist aiming would be where your wrist is just sort of rested. You're just moving around like this. And, you know, that's how you would be able to do a full 360 or however much you're allowing yourself to. Typically, this would be a full 360, and then you can move up and down like this. Typically, this is best for fingertip grip. For your palm gripper, then this is going to be really difficult to use. And the next would be elbow, which would be where you're just resting your elbow on your desk or typically an armchair. And then you just sort of move with your whole elbow, and then you can make little micro adjustments like that. Typically, people who play like this would actually be using a higher sensitivity for the vertical aim, just because they're not allowing themselves too much. And then there's arm, which is what I use, and typically people who are like more skilled, people who are professionals, typically use their whole arm, which would be where you're not anchoring yourself anywhere. You might have a point like this, but typically you're just sort of sliding all over the place and using your entire arm to aim. So how about we get into game, and I'm going to show you some of the styles of how you would be shooting targets. First aiming style is flicking. Simple. It's a flick where you go from point A to point B to shoot. Next would be tracking. So when you're tracking, all you're doing is following the target. So as it's moving, you're just tracking it. A branch off of that is known as micro flicking. So micro flicking is where when you're tracking a target, you're not just doing it smoothly, you're doing it in little micro flicks. There's a couple pro players in Overwatch who do this, and basically they're kind of essentially bursting over and over again, but they're just flicking a little bit each time to readjust and make sure that they're centered on it. I personally use the smooth tracking, where I just try and follow the target as it's moving. Now there's different types of weapons that you're going to have to learn in most FPS games, and there's projectile, which takes a second to travel, and then there's hit scan. Hit scan has no travel time and it just instantly hits. There's two different styles to aiming in that regard, so you typically would have to lead your shots when a target's moving in order to hit it. But if it's hit scan, then you don't have to worry about that. In certain games like Overwatch, you have the option of both, and typically people will play within their preferred style of aiming. Now, some tips to learn all these would be to go into a training ground that you have, and you can just set up like a little scenario like this, and you can practice your flicks. So do this over and over again. And you'll notice I missed one shot, and that's because me personally, I'm a lot stronger flicking to the right than I am flicking to the left, for the most part. So that means that if you find your strength there, you would usually want to set up a scenario like this and then try flicking back and forth and see which side you're more prone to aiming for. Typically, I flick better when I go up and to the right. So when I go up and to the right here, what I want to do is always reset. After the flick, I reset. Typically, the reason we do this is because there's a bit of muzzle flash that kind of accompanies it, and there might be a little bit of recoil. If you're trying to like stay on target, that'd be more tracking, but if you're using something that's single shot, so which is when flicking really matters, is you kind of like do this over and over again, especially for something that shoots a bit slower, like this. You kind of like reset after every time, because the recoil, as you can see, kind of blocks the screen, and you don't want it blocking your screen, so you kind of aim and then look down so you can see, you have vision. That's essentially what the flick looks like. And then when you're tracking, something that's good is that once you lose your target, so say you're doing this and then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, what's happening? Don't just keep spraying. Oftentimes it's sort of an instinctual thing. You lose the target and you just keep spraying. You just keep spraying, hoping that you regain your accuracy. If you lose them, just reset. Look down, reset. A lot of people, especially people who are pros, will naturally do this. Once you lose your target, you just look down. When you look down, you give yourself a little bit of room to at least see them. But the important thing is that you don't overdo it. You don't shoot and then you look way off. You know, you're gonna really mess up your aim that way because you're not gonna see your target anymore. You just wanna make little adjustments, right? If you were to practice this yourself, I'm sure if you were looking at this, if you were to do flicks from here, you should be able to land those pretty much every time. But then the further you get away from it, it's gonna make it a lot harder. So if you're like this at the edge of your screen, it's gonna be much harder to land those flicks than it would be to land flicks that are very close. So when you're flicking, you don't want to go too far off. You just want to go a little bit off. A little bit so that you can still see your target, but not so far that you're going to make it a big movement every time to hit any of those shots. Here's a little test you can do if you have a training area in whatever game you're playing. Overwatch, Apex, CSGO, stuff like this are all going to have options for you to practice your aim with some sort of training ground. Now, this is going to help you learn all the styles. So when it's wrist, whether it's elbow, or when it's full arm. What you're going to do is pick just a single target here. And what you're going to do is just use your wrist to track the target from a very far range. A range far enough that you can actually use your wrist. And then you're going to get a bit closer and you're going to start throwing in the elbow, or at least enough to do it, and then just keep tracking. Keep tracking, make sure you do it as perfectly as you can. And then you want to get really, really close and you want to use your full arm. Your full arm to track the target and try and be as precise as you can. And just do that over and over again and just see how it feels to aim. Eventually you're going to notice, say, when you're wrist aiming far back here, you're really accurate. But then when you're here trying to do an elbow aim, all of a sudden you notice, oh no, it's starting to get a little bit more difficult. And then all of a sudden you're up here and you're just all over the place. You're overcompensating, you're undercompensating, whatever it may be. You need to figure out what area is bothering you and then start to work on that specific area, because there's always going to be moments when you may be really, really far back. You're trying to snipe something and you're moving all over the place, and instead of actually like finding the target and following it, you're just sort of sitting here and waiting. You know, you're just waiting for the target to go into your aim rather than actually following it. Typically, if you're having that issue where you're just all over the place and you have to sit there and wait for a target, that's considered lazy aim. And typically the reason for that is because your sensitivity is just too high. It's so high that you can't even make those little adjustments. You're just flying all over the place. And then when you're really close, you might be super crazy because your sensitivity is so high that you're just like, oh my goodness, like this is ridiculous. Some people might be even too low to the point where they're struggling to keep up as they move this close. It's important to find a balance in both of those scenarios. That way, no matter what range you are, you're comfortable enough. You need to find a place where all different styles of aiming are working for you, not just one where you can only flip, you can only track, you can only do this. You want to make sure that you're good at all those. Thank you for watching the next episode. Like I said, the next topic is going to be about sensitivity. I had a couple requests for sensitivity. I've had it a couple times before in the past where people would ask me what my sensitivity is, if they should lower their sensitivity, raise their sensitivity, what sensitivity should they play at. This is a very difficult topic, I would say, because not one solution is going to work for everybody, so it's hard for me to just tell you what is right and what you should use, but I want to give you at least some of a guideline as to how to find the sensitivity that works perfect for you. This whole video is just sort of to discuss some of the basics before we get into that. That way, when I'm actually discussing these things, you guys have an understanding, and maybe you guys can work on it a bit before we find the right sensitivity. All right, thanks. See you in the next episode.